This is blue-haired feminist Barbie, and she's here to send your children home from school with their own copy of the gay agenda and then tell their conservative white Republican fathers to go eat a giant bag of dick. Okay, so now that we've scared away all of these straight white conservative men, hi everybody, I'm back with another video. Thanks for clicking on this one, and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. I am filming this after dark, which I very much did not want to do because the lighting is crappy, so I apologize for that. I really tried hard to film this earlier in the day, but just, life did not work out that way, so here we are. And I suppose that filming after dark is appropriate for the topic that I'm going to be covering today, which, as you probably saw from the thumbnail, is asexuality and kink. So it's Asexual Awareness Week, and I thought this would be the perfect time to do a video talking a little bit about some of the crossovers between asexuality and kink and why so many aces are into kink, even though it seems contradictory at first. I'm hoping that this video will be up before Ace Week is over, but that depends on how quickly my little neurodivergent squirrel brain manages to get through scripting, editing, filming, and posting, so we'll see. See, I couldn't even say those things in the right order, so who knows when this video will actually go up, so whenever it is that you happen to be catching it, I hope you did have a very good Ace Week. If you have an asexual person in your life, go give them a big hug and tell them you love them and you see them and they're valid. Also, I just want to take a second to remind you to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell and do all of the YouTube things. I keep forgetting to mention that in my videos, I had to actually add it into the script, otherwise I would have forgotten to mention it again. So please do that and help this channel grow so I can keep bringing you awesome content. If you're new here, hi, I'm Megan, and I talk about fashion history, hand sewing, and asexuality, apparently. So if you're into that kind of content, then welcome, and I hope you stick around. A little while ago, I did a poll on my Instagram stories, and I asked you all what you'd like to see for my next video. Kink and asexuality was the topic of choice by an overwhelming majority, so here you go, I am your slave. To be honest, I was kind of hoping you'd want me to talk about polyamory and queer platonic relationships because I've been researching that for more than a year now, ever since I started getting more and more interested in relationship anarchy, but I'll probably do another video on that topic at some point between now and Christmas, but again, who knows, because, neurodivergent squirrel brain. Just a disclaimer, I'm not going to be talking about my personal life in this video, so if that's why you're here, then sorry to disappoint, that is not what this is about. That is information for my partner and my close friends only, not all of the internet, and especially not my family who watch these videos. This is going to be a purely academic discussion about the intersection of asexuality and kink and why so many aro ace people are kinky. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge the fact that unfortunately there's not a lot of information out there about sex averse aces and their relationship to kink. I wish there was more, and I wish I was able to fill in that gap, but I'm sex positive, leaning more sex neutral at times, so I don't feel like I'm really qualified to speak from that perspective. But if you're watching this and you're a sex-averse ace who's into kink, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment about your experiences and perspectives if you're comfortable sharing, because I think we as a community absolutely need to hear more from you. You guys are so underrepresented in these kinds of conversations, so it would be really, really valuable to hear more from your opinion and perspective. I'm also not going to get into a full explanation of asexuality as an orientation in this video because I don't have time for one thing, and because I already did that in my last video, so you can go check that out for a more detailed explanation of what asexuality is and is not, and how it relates to sex and attraction. In fact, if you're not already familiar with the split attraction model and all the different types of attraction that we can feel, I would urge you to go watch that video first before you watch this one, because a lot of the things I talk about here aren't going to make much sense without that foundational knowledge. I do want to emphasize, though, that asexual people are not a monolith, and I will keep repeating that in any and all videos that I do about asexuality going forward because it is so important. We are not a monolith. All of our experiences are different, unique, and valid, and no one asexual person is the same as all asexual people. I'm going to be speaking generally in this video because I have to in order to stay on track, but you should keep in mind that everything I'm about to say is not necessarily true for all aces, and if you're in a relationship with an asexual person or have an asexual person as a playmate or you're considering it, you should always have a conversation with them first about their own boundaries and preferences and experiences before engaging with them in any kind of intimate way, and then revisit that conversation on a regular basis. I mean, you should just do this with everybody you have sex and or play with anyway, because consent is everything, and I shouldn't have to remind you of this, but this is the internet and people say all kinds of wacky shit on here, so if you take away only one thing from this entire video, let it be this: consent is key. Enthusiastic consent. So kink and poly communities are heavily invested in the idea of consent, which is a fantastic thing, not just for sex, but for a variety of other things like relationship models, falling in love and having sex with other people, power dynamics, BDSM, all of that. Consent is a major and non-negotiable factor in polyamorous and open relationships, and it's super important in kink situations too. That being said, a lot of consent education centers around the idea of enthusiastic consent, and while I understand why and also why it's important, especially for allosexual people, to frame it in this way, as an asexual person, I actually have a huge issue with the idea of enthusiastic consent, because I might give affirmative consent to a sexual situation and fully wholeheartedly commit myself to it, but is it enthusiastic? Most of the time, no. Like, I'm never gonna go, yes, please do sex things to me now. It's more of a, sure, we can do that. Why not? I mean, I know it feels good for you, and I like that I can make you happy, and it's nice to be able to connect with you in that way. So, okay, that's fine. I don't mind. But it's very rarely ever going to be like a hell yes situation. When people are urged to seek enthusiastic consent, it can feel like asexual people are being excluded from those conversations, and some of the dialogue around consent can inadvertently make us seem like we're not capable of giving it because it's not enthusiastic. I actually just had a conversation the other night with someone who's also ace and kinky, and we talked about enthusiastic consent, and he has a big issue with it as well. I've also heard other ace educators and content creators mention that it bothers them, so this is maybe an area where education around consent needs to be a little more inclusive of those of us on the aro ace spectrum. Even for sex-positive aces, a lot of the time sex just isn't that amazing for us, and it can actually be super boring sometimes. One of my ace friends told me that he puts it in the same category as doing the dishes. Like, yeah, okay, this is something I need to do for the health and maintenance of my relationships, but would I do it if it wasn't a necessity? Absolutely not. Often, sex isn't really a priority, nor is it something we're motivated to do for its own sake, and it's not a priority in our intimate interpersonal relationships either. It baffles me how much weight and importance allosexual people give to sex, because to me, it's just another thing you can do, like going for a hike in nature, which is another thing I'm very meh about. If you're allosexual and watching this, think of an activity that you've done in the past that maybe you didn't hate doing, but it wasn't like the most fun thing you've ever done either, or something that you would want to spend time doing of your own volition. If someone you loved asked you to do that activity with them and you said yes, you probably wouldn't be super excited about it necessarily, but you also wouldn't hate doing it either. You would be like happy to make them happy. That's what sex is like for a lot of sex neutral and sex positive aces. It's just another activity that we could potentially do, just like all the other activities that are out there and available to us. And a lot of the time, it's not one that we feel particularly strongly about either way. So when it comes to consent, expecting it to be enthusiastic is a bit unrealistic for a lot of aspec people, but it doesn't mean that we can't give it affirmatively with full knowledge and authenticity, if that makes sense. For ace people who participate in kink and poly communities, they can be a place where we are able to give enthusiastic consent. It can be a relief when you open your relationship and your partner is able to have other sexual partners who do desire them in that way and who are as enthusiastic about sex as they are. And it can be very healing and fulfilling to participate in kink activities that are sensual and not sexual, because then you can finally get to have all those physical sensations that you actually desire without the specter of sexual contact hanging over you like the entire time. All of that being said, enthusiastic consent is important, especially if you're allosexual. Always, always, always talk about consent with your partners or potential partners. All I'm saying is that if you know that your partner is asexual, consent might look a little bit different for them, so it's really important to ask them what it means to them to give consent and then respect their boundaries at all times. Like, that should just go without saying. What is kink? Despite what we see in all the stereotypes and media portrayals of kink and BDSM, a lot of the time it's not sexual at all. Kink has a lot more to do with exploring and enjoying different kinds of touch, emotions, relationships, sensations, and power dynamics than it does with sexual gratification. It can be sexual, but a lot of the time it isn't. And like, really, this should just be the end of this video right here, but kink and BDSM are so widely misunderstood by the mainstream that I'm going to have to go a bit more in depth, just like I did when talking about asexuality. To understand kink, you first have to understand the difference between sensual and sexual sensations. Sensual sensations are the ones that make you just feel good, or they might relax you or help you turn your brain off. Having someone play with your hair or getting massage or getting brain tingles from ASMR videos are all sensual feelings, and they're not inherently sexual, although they often get confused with sexual feelings. I think a lot of us can remember being in elementary school and sitting on the carpet and drawing on each other's backs. Remember that feeling of like goosebumps all over your body? There was nothing sexual about that. It was just a good feeling. Sexual feelings, however, are the ones that turn you on and make you feel horny and make you feel like you want to have sex. Kink for a lot of people is about sensual experience. Maybe you like the way that scalding hot water feels on your skin, or cold steel, or someone's fingers trailing down your back. Some people like the sensation of being tied up, of rope sticking into them, or being flogged. None of this is inherently sexual. It can be for some people, but the point is that it doesn't have to be. That's kind of what a lot of kink sensations are like. They're just things that feel good, but not necessarily in a sexual way. If you have those kinds of sensory needs, then kink communities can be a great place to explore them in a way that's safe, consensual, and fulfilling. Sometimes, especially for asexual people, it can be hard to get those needs met in the context of a relationship with an allosexual person, especially if it's a hetero relationship. If you've ever tried telling a straight man that you want him to touch your naked body in a non-sexual way, you know exactly how frustrating it can be for both of you, unless you're willing to have some pretty deep conversations instead of just assuming that something is sexual when it might not be. And this can be where it gets confusing and complex, because the line between sensual and sexual is different for everyone. Like, for example, for one person, someone touching their butt or touching someone else's butt might not be a sexual thing. It might be a good, tingly, relaxing ASMR type feeling, but it's not sexual, it's sensual. For another person, however, someone touching their butt might be very sexual. So this is why it's really important to have a conversation or a series of conversations with your partners to find out what's sexual for them and what isn't, and what kind of contact and sensations they prefer and desire, and what they're comfortable with, and then you communicate yours as well, and you go from there. This is just another reason why consent is so important in kink and BDSM, because you can't just assume that something you find sexual is also sexual for someone else, or that they're even looking to get anything sexual out of it in the first place. Kink can also be a very emotional thing. A lot of scenes that involve some of the more extreme kinks are very intimate. It requires a level of trust and vulnerability that goes beyond what normal sex requires, and for aces who enjoy sex for the emotional connection, kink can be even more satisfying in that way, because so many more and deeper emotions can come up during a scene. Aftercare can also be a very intimate and emotional thing, and if you're someone who craves that kind of intense emotional connection, then kink dynamics can be a good place to get it, because regular meat and potato sex doesn't always deliver that kind of depth and intensity. Participating in kink scenes can also be a way to heal and deal with any mental health issues or emotional trauma, although I do want to be careful when talking about this, because I don't want to perpetuate any of the harmful stereotypes about people who are into kink being somehow damaged. First of all, we're all damaged and we all have trauma, and if you've made it to adulthood, then you probably have some trauma just from growing up, because no one is perfect and everyone messes up their kids in some way. Second of all, being into kink does not automatically mean that someone is traumatized or damaged or somehow defective, and that's a really shitty stereotype that needs to be immediately shot down. People are into kink for all kinds of reasons, many of which I've touched on already, and it doesn't have to be a way to process and heal from trauma. It doesn't have to be that deep, and sometimes people just like what they like, and shaming them for it is mean, and it's a major red flag that the person doing the judging and shaming is actually the one who has some learning and healing to do. That being said, some people do enjoy kink as a way to process and heal from trauma, and it's important to emphasize that in those cases, it's not a substitute for therapy. It can be a good thing to do in conjunction with therapy, but it should never be used instead of it. However, if you're doing the work in therapy to address your trauma and deal with your mental health, then kink can be a very healing, very cathartic supplementary exercise as long as it's something that you feel comfortable with and truly desire. For example, if you struggle with harm OCD, then being a dom in a kink scene or a BDSM situation can be a good way to do your ERP exercises in a safe and controlled environment where your partner is consenting to being submissive. But obviously, this is very extreme, and you should only ever do this with the support of a good therapist who specializes in OCD and exposure response prevention. Okay, now this is controversial, but many people have told me this is a thing that works for them, so it bears mentioning here. If someone grew up in a repressive conservative religion that emphasizes purity culture, consensual non-con and or BDSM power dynamics can be a safe place for them to explore their sexuality without the guilt or shame around sex that was imposed on them by their upbringing. Controversial, yes, and definitely not for everybody, and a lot of people will push back on that, but it is a thing that people do. If you're neurodivergent and struggle with social anxiety and knowing what to do or not to do in social situations, the level of communication that's involved in kink can be very reassuring, and it can help you work through that anxiety. If you struggle to assertively communicate your boundaries, kink can be great for that also, because it allows you to practice talking about them in a safe space with other people who are more experienced in those kinds of conversations and don't mind taking the lead. At the end of the day, if you've grown up in this society, then you've likely internalized compulsory heterosexuality because it gets shoved down our throats all the time from childhood and all the way through our lives. It comes from absolutely everywhere: movies, cartoons, ads, TV shows, books, sex ed, you name it. And it can be a really long and difficult journey to unlearn that. It's why a lot of asexual people and a lot of queer people in general end up feeling like we're broken or defective. It's assumed that everyone is straight, cisgendered, and allosexual until and unless proven otherwise. There's no room in our cultural narrative for queer feelings or desires or exploration, and we don't generally see much representation of that. Representation and acceptance of queer people is still predicated on the condition that we're portrayed as being monogamous, partnered, and following the life script. So maybe we're queer, maybe we're in a same-sex partnership, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We're just like straight people, see? We also want to get married and buy a house in the suburbs and have children and raise them with a Protestant work ethic so they can grow up to become good little worker bees and get bonus points for telling their classmates at school that they have 2 dads. Representation of queer people in the media is still limited by patriarchal and capitalist mythology that glorifies the nuclear family, and there's no room for polyamorous relationships or queer platonic partnerships or kink or BDSM dynamics. Those things are still marginalized, still othered, and still seen as transgressive and deviant, even though they require a shit ton more love, intimacy, respect, and communication than your average monogamous heterosexual relationship. As one of my best friends says, queer people get non-consensually fucked by society all of the time. So when we fuck each other, hopefully we're doing it with a little extra dose of love and respect. Asexuality and kink. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the basics of what kink is and is not, you might be asking yourself, kink and asexuality, how do those things go together? And I get it, it seems like a contradiction at first. People get so confused by the existence of kinky aces, but there's a lot of overlap between kink communities and the aroace community. I'm speaking very broadly here, and this is certainly not the case for everyone, but asexual people, for the most part, just naturally separate and isolate different kinds of attraction, and we understand on this very deep level how all of these different types of attraction intersect. We get how something can be sensual but not sexual, and many of us can experience romantic attraction without any sexual attraction, or we can do what look like sexual things from the outside without ever being aroused by them. There are tons of kinky aces out there, and when you break down what kink is and what asexuality is, it actually makes a lot of sense. Almost all of the kink and BDSM educators on YouTube, like Evie Lupine and Morgan Thorne, are asexual, and just anecdotally so far, all of the aces that I've met, both in real life and online, are also into kink, even the ones who are sex neutral. One thing that many aces understand intuitively, pretty much from the cradle, is that sex and intimacy are not the same thing. They can be, but they don't have to be. You can have sex without intimacy, and you can have intimacy without sex, just like you can have sex without kink and kink without sex. Like I said in my previous video about asexuality, aces are often very good at talking about sex objectively, so we make really good educators in that sense, because for a lot of us, sex and intimacy are just things that exist, and they're not really a big deal, and we don't necessarily assign the same weight and importance to them as the rest of society does. So we can talk about sex and talk about our boundaries related to sex with a level of detachment that some allosexual people wouldn't be able to comfortably do. A lot of us also have a very academic interest in sex. One of the creators of the Ace Couple podcast here on YouTube, I'll link to them below, they're amazing, mentioned in an episode that her interest in kink started out as something she was intellectually curious about, and that's how a lot of aces actually get into the kink scene. It might start out as a special interest or something we find fascinating from like an academic, intellectual standpoint, and then we go down this rabbit hole, and then it can become almost like a social experiment that we are driven to participate in. Also, some aspec people vastly prefer sensual touch over sexual contact. I once heard an ace woman describe penetration as a similar sensation to someone repeatedly jamming their finger into her nostril, and that it was something she tolerated but didn't love. As I mentioned earlier in this video, kink can be a way to get your sensory needs met without having to then deal with the sudden cold water bath of sexual contact right afterwards. Sometimes it's nice to just enjoy all of the good tingly feelings without someone jamming their finger in your nostril immediately afterwards. Kink scenes can also be very aesthetically pleasing, and this is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough in my opinion. Like, there's something so aesthetically satisfying about a St. Andrew's cross just hanging out in the middle of a darkly lit room, or a leather harness worn over a sheer black dress a la Anne Demulmeister. I personally love leather and latex just as artistic mediums. I love wearing them, I love working with them, and I love creating garments out of them, but it's not a sexual thing or even a sensual thing. A lot of people who are into latex say that they love the sensation of wearing it, but for me, it doesn't feel any different from wearing any other type of material. I love latex and leather because I love the way they look, full stop. That's it. I think it's so much fun to play around with them and wear them with different fabrics and textures. The contrast of wearing latex or leather and silk at the same time and the juxtaposition of what those two materials represent is just so aesthetically and artistically delicious and satisfying to me. I would categorize my love of latex and leather as being purely aesthetic in the same way I love Kandinsky's paintings. Kink can be a type of performance art, and a lot of asexual people who are also artists might enjoy it for that reason. Kink spaces and communities can also be really welcoming and safe for asexual people, and a lot of aces just straight up prefer kink play over meat and potatoes sex because, let's be real here, sex can be kind of boring. Kink, on the other hand, is fun. With kink, you can use your imagination. There's a lot of talking involved, a lot of intimacy and communication, a lot of heightened emotions and different sensations that change all the time. A lot of aces also tend to over-intellectualize sex because it's not necessarily something that's intuitive for us or that we're naturally inclined to do. Having normal sex can be really mentally exhausting because you're always having to think about what you should be doing next or what your partner expects. Kink situations, on the other hand, are often discussed beforehand and everyone knows what they're supposed to do, so it takes away a lot of that guesswork and over-intellectualizing. This can be a big relief for aces who otherwise would just be very confused during sex, especially sex with a new person, when all they want to do is relax and enjoy a sensation or connect with someone in an intensely emotional way, but regular sex doesn't offer any kind of blueprint or roadmap on how to do that in the same way that kink does. Side note, if you've noticed by now that there seems to be a lot of crossover between asexuality and neurodivergence, you'd be right. But that's another video with another stereotype to debunk at another time. Kink is so focused on consent and negotiation that those communities and dynamics can actually feel a lot safer for asexual people than traditional relationships where there's often the expectation of frequent sex, even if it crosses boundaries for the partner who's ace. When asexual people get into relationships with allosexual people, there can be this pressure that we put on ourselves to make up for our asexuality and give in to our partner's needs and desires. It can end up feeling like we no longer have any agency over our bodies and our sexuality, and sex then becomes like this thing we do for our partners to make them happy, and it's not really about us and what we want and need. So kink and BDSM can be really helpful spaces for asexual people to unlearn compet. For asexual doms, getting to control every aspect of a sexual situation means that they can actually enjoy and fully participate in it while also being able to uphold and maintain their boundaries around sex at the same time. Sometimes the only way that intimate physical contact can be enjoyable for aces who are dominant is if their partners completely surrender to them for a change and they get to be the ones calling all the shots. And those shots might be sexual, but they also might not be. For aces who are subs, giving up full control to a partner with whom you've built a lot of intimacy and trust can be really healing and cathartic because ideally, if you're at the point of participating in kink, then you would have had a lot of conversations about consent and boundaries and would trust them to not make it sexual at any point if you weren't comfortable with that. I know I said I wasn't going to get personal or talk about my relationship with kink in this video, but I will say this and only this. For me, kink has nothing to do with sex. It's not a sexual thing at all, at least not to me. And actually, for a long long time, I didn't even realize that what I like and desire is kinky because it's not sexual. And I had, like most people, just assumed that kink is always and only something you do for sexual gratification. A lot of aces are also attracted to situations, circumstances, and ideas rather than to people. This is very common, and not being sexually attracted to anyone, no matter their gender, is literally the definition of asexuality. When it comes to kink scenes, it's not the person they find sexy, it's the act, the situation, and or the feeling. And that might be the only way that a lot of aces can enjoy sex. Think about this for a second. If you could only ever have sex with people you weren't attracted to, you would have to come up with some pretty elaborate fantasies and situations in your head in order to make sex work for you. Sex is in our heads. Another way that asexual people experience kink is in our imaginations. Even for sex-positive aces, all of our sex happens in our heads. It's really hard to explain what I mean by that to allosexual people, but if you're ace and you have any kind of libido, you probably heard me say that and then immediately knew exactly what I meant. This is purely anecdotal, and I have no hard data or good research to back this up whatsoever, but a lot of the aces I know in real life and online prefer to have sex alone, and they get aroused by elaborate fantasies that they would actually lose interest in if they were ever to be acted out in real life with real people and real genitals. And actually, I'm willing to bet my entire Barbie collection that most, if not all, of the really, really good fan fiction, erotica, and fantasy novels out there are written by people who are on the ace spectrum. As I mentioned before, when you're not attracted to any of the people you have sex with, and it will never be possible for you to have sex with someone you're attracted to because you don't feel sexual attraction, then you kind of have to get creative. Some ace-spec people might prefer the idea of something to the actual reality of it, and a lot of aces' relationship with kink might exist entirely in their heads because their kinks aren't even physically possible. This is where the connection to fanfiction and erotica comes in, because writing stories about their physically impossible kinks might be the only way that some aces are able to experience them. Back to the idea that normal sex can be a very boring and mentally exhausting activity, introducing an element of fantasy or storytelling or role play, even if it's just in our heads, can turn what might otherwise feel like a chore into a fun little game that you play with your partner or partners. This also serves to take the focus away from the actual sex, as it then becomes more about enjoying the experience than about racing each other to orgasm. A lot of sex-positive aces enjoy sex for this reason, as a journey and an opportunity to dress up, to play, to experiment, and to have fun. Sex positivity. So I think I've covered all the bases, so I'm going to end this video with a note about sex positivity, because I think it's important to talk about this in the context of asexuality, and I want to leave you all with this idea to consider. Saying that you're sex positive comes with a lot of baggage, because a lot of people still assume that sex positivity means you openly and enthusiastically pursue lots of intimate relationships with all kinds of people. And if you don't do that, then you're not really sex positive, and you must have some sort of attachment to heteronormativity and or purity culture. That's a really harmful stereotype that aces get slapped with a lot in general, and it can be especially frustrating for sex positive aces who are into kink or want to participate in polyamorous communities, but have this fear that their boundaries and their aversion to certain things will be misconstrued as slut shaming or being frigid, when that's not at all the case. Like, I will never judge anyone for wanting the kind of sex and relationship models that they want, no matter how transgressive they are. So please do not judge me for wanting what I want, yeah? Sex positivity means different things to different people, and if you know an asexual person who identifies as sex positive, it's a good idea to ask them what that means to them, instead of just assuming that they're going to want to do all this kinky sexual stuff with all these different people. Just like it's important to have a conversation with your partners and playmates about what they consider to be sexual contact versus non-sexual or sensual contact, it's also important to ask them what sex positivity means to them and how they define it for themselves. You should never assume that just because someone says they're sex positive, it means they're down to do pretty much any and everything, or that they have multiple partners, or even that they want to have sex at all. This is all part of those conversations around consent that I talked about earlier in the video, and is really, really important to have those conversations before engaging in like any kind of intimate contact with anybody. Also be aware that people's boundaries and preferences are fluid, and that they can and do change. Always, always, always check in with your partners on a regular basis, and never assume that what what was true for them the last time you talked is still true for them now. Don't ever assume that your definition and categorization of something is the same as someone else's. So that about covers everything I wanted to say about kink and asexuality, and this video actually ended up being a little bit longer than I thought. I thought it was just going to be like a short explanation because, like, to me it just seems really simple and intuitive, but I mean, I guess if you're not asexual, it can be kind of confusing to like think about how people who aren't sexually attracted to anybody might participate in things like kink or BDSM that are considered by society to be sexual. So hopefully I've given you at least one new thing to think about, or debunked a stereotype, or clarified something for you that maybe you've been thinking about but haven't quite solidified in your mind yet. I was completely blown away by the overwhelmingly positive responses to my last video about asexuality. So a huge thank you to everyone who watched that video and took the time to comment and bravely tell us about your stories, perspectives, and journeys. I read through every single one of your comments, and each one was so important and so valid, and I appreciated it so much because the more of us who can share about our experiences, the more we can start to unpack together some of the harmful messages that we've internalized and represent our community in a positive and constructive way. So thank you. If you're asexual or aromantic or both and you're into kink, I would love to hear from you if you're comfortable sharing. If I missed anything in this video, please feel free to add it in the comments below, and let's get this conversation going. Let's debunk some of the stereotypes about kink. Once again, happy Ace Week to all my Aspec brothers and sisters. I hope you all got to eat some cake and celebrate your queerness. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I will see you all again soon with some sewing tutorials. Yes, that's right. I have some of those in the works. I'm actually going to film the intro to one of them right now whilst I have everything set up, so stay tuned because those are coming soon. I also have a video in the works about polyamory and queer platonic partnerships, which, as I mentioned earlier in this video, has been like a huge rabbit hole for me for the past year, as I've been like learning more and more about relationship anarchy. So stay tuned for that because that's going to be a fun one. Okay, so I hope you all have an awesome evening or whatever time of day it is that you are watching this, and I will see you all in the next one. Toodaloo!